I'm Dr. Brad Hafford. Welcome to Note Nook, where I take a close look at a banknote from the relatively recent past. In this series, I'm analyzing paper money from around the world, paying close attention to one example in each episode. As an anthropologist, I'm more interested in what money says than what it's worth. And it says a great deal about the government that issued it and the people who used it. Today, we look at a $1 note issued in Canada in 1954. We begin by looking at the obverse, or front of the note. Unfortunately, this note is not in great condition. I have many other Canadian 1954 $1 bills, but I've chosen this one because it's an early issue known as a devil's face note. I'll leave that phrase hanging for now and explain later. The obverse of a note typically emphasizes the issuing authority and often carries an image of an important person from the country. In this case, the issuing authority is the Bank of Canada, written both in English and French. This bilingual theme plays out across the note, with English at left and French at right, such as, "Will pay the bearer on demand" here, and "Payera au porteur sur demande" over here. This was a common phrase in the language of an issuing country over much of the history of banknote usage. It emphasizes the stand-in nature of paper money. In other words, paper was typically trusted only as a promise that silver or gold was on hand in the nation's banks to back it up. The Canadian silver dollar that a bearer would receive on demand in 1954 weighed just over 23 grams and was made up of 80% silver. By comparison, the U.S. silver dollar weighed almost 27 grams and contained 90% silver. Silver content of different currencies allowed for a direct exchange rate between countries, as well as giving users confidence in the paper note representing it. Another aspect that ascribed confidence in the currency were the signatures of financial officers, typically bank officials who were certifying that the silver or gold was on hand to cover the note's value. After the precious metal standards were dropped, such signatures remained on most notes as symbols of bank support. Faith in the issuing authority became the sole basis of currency. Here, we have the letterpress overstrike signatures of the bank governor, J.E. Coyne, and the deputy governor, J.R. Beatty. And in the center of the background, behind the black overprint, is the Canadian coat of arms. This is the first Canadian note to bear it. And the national motto also stands here in Latin, a mare usque ad mare, from sea to sea. And this indicates the expanse of the nation from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The presence of national symbols and phrases further enhances the faith in the note, showing that not only the bank, but also the nation's government stands behind the currency. Around the note, we have an intricate frame of web-like design with the denomination placed within it. This is a common element in banknotes, especially those printed by North American companies. Early issues of the $1 1954 were exclusively printed by the Canadian Banknote Company, but the British American Banknote Company joined in with later issues. In the subtle light green background, we have still more detail. Not only are there fine lines of shading with a slightly darker green beneath the Bank of Canada banner and lighter above, but there are also images and writing contained within it. Repeated in ovals across the background are the words Bank of Canada, $1, in both English and French. To further discourage counterfeit, many banknotes include watermarks, areas of differing thickness in the paper to create a pattern or image in a strong backlight. But there's no such area here. Instead, this note relies on its level of detail and its varying green color to make it hard to duplicate. The final and most noticeable sign of official acceptance is the portrait of Canada's head of state, Britain's Queen Elizabeth II. King George VI died in 1952, and his daughter Elizabeth was crowned in June 1953. The portrait photograph used as the basis of the engraving that appears on this note was taken by Yusuf Karsh in 1951 when she was still officially a princess. Not only was this the first Canadian note to feature Queen Elizabeth, but the placement of the monarch's portrait was also new. Prior notes held the king's portrait in an oval at the center, but the issuers felt that the new open placement at the right, with a subtle shadow behind the queen, would make the portrait more difficult to copy. Furthermore, a bill is most often folded in half, leaving a heavy crease in the center. This meant that the king's portrait had been the most often damaged part of a note, and moving the portrait would help to alleviate this effect. Of course, a note can also be folded in quarters, as in this case, and so a heavy fold across the queen's face could still happen. There is another, more surprising effect noticeable in the queen's hair. Not long after the issuance of this 1954 series of notes, the general public began to notice a pattern in the curls behind her left ear. Look closely to see if you can make it out. The people claimed to see a devil's face there. Some believed the face was intentional, and they blamed anyone from the engraver to French-Canadian separatists. But the human mind has a propensity to see faces in relatively random patterns. This is called pareidolia. In this case, the mind, admittedly you have to push it a bit, can perceive a rather gnarled and angry face, one that could be imagined to be demonic. It was the last thing the Canadian government wanted associated with their money, so they quickly ordered an alteration of the plates, lessening the highlights on the queen's hair curls and thus erasing the demonic effect. Let's now look at the reverse. The reverse of a note often emphasizes the laws that authorize or protect it. Here, however, we have only the further mention of the bank and the denomination, again in English at left and French at right. It bears the same sort of intricate webbed framing device, but otherwise the entire back is given over to a wide-open rural scene. It thus becomes obvious why the 1954 notes were termed the Canadian Landscape Series. The designers had abandoned the overall ornamental and allegorical elements of the 1937 series, as they now felt too colonial for the modernizing 1950s. Instead, the new notes emphasized rising Canadian nationalism and open, more legible space. Thus, we are presented with the overwhelming openness of the Saskatchewan prairie, through which runs a long and straight road into the far distance. All of the photos considered as basis for the note's reverse imagery were rural, with no large buildings and little indication of people. This was thought to keep them based on Canadian country, rather than any particular group or activity. So the $1 reverse depicts this long and lonely road trekking endlessly across the Saskatchewan prairie while dark billowing clouds crowd the sky above. Some are dropping sheets of rain in the distance, watering the agricultural fields. The image conjures the great scale of Canadian landscape, but there are also endless telephone poles, a farmhouse, and a vehicle in the far distance, indications that this long track of dirt road is a conduit that links cities and modern inhabitants. The subtle shifts of scene and the wide image were parts of the detail that would be difficult to copy, and thus they were further protections against counterfeit. Nevertheless, by 1967, the year Canada reached its 100th year of Confederation, there were many counterfeits circulating, and a new series was introduced. So, what does this note tell us about Canada in 1954? Both French and English are included because Canada is a bilingual nation at the federal level. In fact, both France and Britain had colonial interests in Canada into the 18th century, but by 1763, France had ceded most of its territory to Great Britain. In 1867, the three major British Canadian colonies confederated and took on the title of Dominion. This indicated their status as an autonomous nation that held continued allegiance to the British Crown. The designation of Dominion was largely dropped after the Second World War, when the Commonwealth of Nations became a clearer concept, and Britain began decolonizing in earnest. Over the next century, Canada strengthened as a nation, gaining more autonomy in 1931 and eventually cutting all legal dependence on British Parliament in 1982. Though her portrait is less common on Canadian notes today, Queen Elizabeth remains sovereign of Canada, more symbolically than anything else. She is represented by a Governor-General as head of state, but just as in Britain, the Crown rarely, if ever, exercises governmental powers. Those are vested in the Canadian Parliament and its Prime Minister. Some claim that the reverse image depicts the famous Trans-Canadian Highway. However, although construction on the highway began in 1950. It didn't officially open until 1962. The road here appears to be a dirt one, and the photo on which the engraving is based long predates the 1954 issuance. So if it is the Trans-Canada Highway, it is an old road that was reworked into a portion of that official highway much later. Nevertheless, building the new highway and issuing the new notes are both indications of the expansion and integration that characterized the 1950s in Canada. I hope you enjoyed looking at this banknote with me. I'm Dr. Brad Hafford. Join me again next time on Note Nook, part of my series, Money Talks.